Hello and welcome to the Game Business Show. Last week we delved into the UK games industry, whereas this week we're taking a closer look at the economic realities in the US games market. Plus, 11-bit studios and the alters is in hot water with fans over AI-generated text, and we look at the performance of Stranding 2. But before we get to that, I'd like to welcome our guest host for the show. She's an award-winning news reporter and investigative journalist, currently working over at IGN. It's Rebekah Valentine. Welcome, Rebekah.
Hi, Chris. Nice to talk to you again.
Yes, Rebekah and I worked at gamesindustry.biz for, 3 years? Longer than 3 years?
A little over 3, yeah.
Glory days, good times.
Taught me everything I know.
Well, I think that was probably everyone else. I caught up with your, I read the story last night that you posted. It's over a month old now, about the creation of the Pokemon logo, which is... I absolutely love these stories. I love it when you do stories like this because it's really a wonderful human story about this designer that was brought in at the last minute to create something that would go on to become an icon, basically. Where did these come from, Rebekah? Do you just hear about them on the forums? How do you even discover little gems like this?
Well, this one was sort of odd. I do joke because most of my reporting is serious and often kind of grim and depressing, unfortunately. I joke that, every 5 or 6 stories or so, they have to throw me a silly one to keep me happy. And somebody usually does. But yeah, I mean, normally stories like this come from just being embedded in video game communities and seeing interesting things that people are doing or running into interesting people. This one fell into my lap. I got an email out of nowhere from this fellow, Chris Maple. I was very skeptical of it at first because you might listen to this and think this is funny, but I get emails like this kind of all the time of people saying, because he's sort of promoting his own work, which is fine. He's a graphic designer, does really, really wonderful work. And he was talking about this story that, is now, almost 25 years old. He was telling that this happened and was very, very much trying to get a story in a publication somewhere. And I'm always skeptical of that because I get emails all the time of people trying to promote their books or whatever. And also I looked him up online and the only information I could find that attached his name to this logo was his own website that, he's had for years, but he had only recently updated to have all his Pokemon stuff on it. I sat down and talked to him and he had so many very specific details in it that it seemed like it had to be true, but I had to do quite a bit of legwork to poke around and confirm that he was indeed who he says he was. And he was. People who worked there at Nintendo of America at the time, multiple people confirmed to me that, yeah, that's the guy.
I just love it because it's not just about, here's how I made a logo. And yes, at the end, he's pitching to work effectively. But it's about, sitting in the lobby and being given the pitch and having the... And all of that, the picture of him with his son on the computer.
Yeah.
And I love the hunt for the crystal horse head that you had to go on.
Right. The reason why that became a detail I focused in on is because I was trying to prove that he was who he said he was. And he gave that detail in the interview. And it's just such a specific... He talks about sitting in the lobby of Nintendo of America waiting to go hear this pitch to make this logo for them. And he remembers seeing this crystal horse head decoration in the lobby. And he just explained this with such detail and fascination. And I thought, well, no one who was making this up would come up with that weird detail. And so I was having trouble at first finding somebody who could confirm that they knew him. I did eventually do that. But when I was having that trouble, I thought, well, maybe as a backup, I can find someone who remembers the crystal horse head. Because if somebody else independently calls that out, then it's much more likely, and maybe not 100% provable, but significantly more likely that he is really who he says he is. And then as I went down that rabbit hole, it just got sillier and sillier until I ended up talking to Lance Barr.
Well, it's not been found, but I love the fact it was in the Game Over book, which I think most have read at some point.
Somebody emailed me, just some person who read the article emailed me and said, hey, I read this book and I'm pretty sure it mentions the horse head. And how do you remember that one detail from that book?
I know.
It's what fetid.
I wouldn't have remembered that. I just love those stories. I've done a few little things in the past. I did the making of the first FIFA game, which wasn't the plan. The plan was to do a very factual story about the history of the FIFA franchise. And I found a very human story about how that first game was sort of pitched and made and came to be. And it's just, I don't know. And I love that story. People should read it. That's what I'm saying. It's a nice story. It's a happy story. It's a nostalgic story. it's not at all depressing than compared to what our first topic is today on the show. There are other stories that are breaking at the moment in the video games industry that we're not able to talk about because at the time of recording, they hadn't gone live. You will know what they are because we would have certainly covered it on the game business before you've listened to this. But our big story this week on this show is looking at the tough economic situation in the US video game market and just the US economy generally. The Game Business Live last month, our live event that we did in Los Angeles, we had Circana director Matt Piscatella join us on stage to share with us some data around how consumers are thinking and feeling about the economy. There is one positive. He had a big list. We're going to put the video up, by the way, on YouTube, so you can watch the video. I watch it because he does have slides, and one of the slides is he had a positive thing that's happening to the US consumer, which is the inflation is starting to cool, which is positive. Then he had this big long list of negatives. So, in higher prices, declining consumer sentiment, increased household debt, tariff uncertainty. And that's not even all of them. It sort of set the tone really for what was a slightly unhappy presentation. Matt shared some data that was from Civic Science, who have been surveying consumer sentiment around the economy. They do it several times a year, more than once a month. And in its last report, consumer sentiment around the economy is at its lowest point since July 2022. And that's been consistently going down all year. In the first quarter of this year, there was a GDP contraction in the US, but even so, retail spending was up 4.6% compared to the year prior. So despite all of those headwinds, higher prices, lower confidence, etc., consumers were still spending. This is Q1 data, so it's up till March.
Yeah.
And Rebekah, I'm sure you're about to point this out, what they were spending that money on was food and drink. So food and drink spending was up 3%. The money spent on non-edible things, that's things you can buy from grocery stores, pharmacies and stuff you can't eat, that was up 2%. But general merchandise, which is everything basically that isn't essential items, games is in there, tech's in there, apparel's in there, that was down 2%. But these increases are to do with spend, it's not to do with number of things sold. As food and drink prices have gone up and up and up. And actually, when you look at what the amount of units of things being sold, food and drink is flat, non-edible products is down 1%. So the spending increase is entirely driven by the fact that food and drink costs more to spend. All that data, and there was a lot of it, is just showing that consumers are being forced to pull back on spending because they're getting tapped out on higher prices. Again, I'm not going to do the whole presentation, but Circana said that car insurance prices are up 6.4%, utilities up 15.7%, shelter up 4%. All of that's putting pressure on the consumer. 55% of US consumers are looking for sales deals more often as a result of rising prices. 44% are cutting back on non-essentials. 80% of consumers are concerned about a potential recession in the coming months, which is also impacting their decision. I will cut to a clip from Matt, Rebekah, but that doesn't. I mean, this is everywhere, right? This isn't particularly a US problem at the moment. We're going to talk about tariffs in a moment, which is more perhaps concentrated on the US. But it's just not a great market to be selling stuff in that isn't essential.
No, it doesn't feel great. I was curious what the numbers were going to shake out to there because I'm going off memory here, but I remember listening to an NPR report about this same topic that was talking about there was an increase in spending, or at least flat spending in Q1 because people were stocking up because they were hearing about these tariffs. And so a lot of people were spending more trying to make sure that they had whatever it was they needed to sort of brace for things suddenly disappearing. And things haven't vanished off store shelves or anything. I mean, maybe certain things have, but for the most part, things are available, but you feel it every single day here. It's just everything is wildly expensive. And when you take all that in aggregate, I don't know. I understand why people are complaining about $80 games.
Yeah, there's confusion a little bit. You talk about stocking up there. Product availability is a concern, but basically tariff sentiment is fluctuating quite widely. Rather than me continue to read it out, here is Matt Piscatella himself to share more details on tariffs and what the games industry can potentially do about this situation.
We've seen dramatic swings every time we've talked to consumers so far about where they stand on tariffs. About 35% of people we talked to in January probably didn't know what a tariff was. They started to learn a little bit. They started hearing those news reports by March, and the opposition to tariffs strongly increased. So in January, we had a net 9% support of tariffs that was across the board. Democrat voters, Republican voters, Harris won states, Trump, it doesn't matter. there was a 9% pro support margin for tariffs. By March, that had fallen to down 6%. In April, following all the various announcements around it, it actually came back up a little bit to a net negative 1.1%. So consumers are still figuring this out. And that group of people in the middle, that 30% of consumers that still don't know where they stand on tariffs, they're waiting to see the impact. They've heard about the impact, but they haven't seen it fully quite yet. Now, two other kind of wacky charts, I'll get you through this. Regardless if people support or oppose tariffs, they both believe that it will lead to increased prices. That red line you see on the left, that's the folks that believe that tariffs will increase pricing in the US. It's gone to now 69%. And again, on the right-hand side of that, whether, again, people support or oppose, the idea of tariffs increasing pricing is increasing with both groups. The key differentiator is the expected impact on wages and jobs. So on the right side there, you can see those wacky lines going everywhere. This is the amount of people who believe that tariffs will lead to a positive impact on wages and jobs, a negative impact on wages and jobs, or those that aren't sure. We're seeing strong bouncing around in this measure, but the differentiator, and you can see it on the right, those people who support tariffs believe it will have a positive impact on wages and jobs. The people who oppose tariffs believe it'll have a negative impact. That's the key differentiator, whether people support or oppose the tariff situation in the US at the moment. All right, so what does this mean? Well, about 40% of consumers are expecting the higher prices driven by potential tariffs to lead to a reduction in their spending. And where they're looking to cut back, all those areas, and they're right there in the middle, are those categories that impact gaming. About 30% of those folks who say they're going to cut back on spending are going to try to cut back in areas of entertainment subscriptions and video games. Now, this isn't everybody, of course, but this is a portion of the market that will or are intending to pull back a little bit, driven by these higher prices we may be seeing. All right, so last bit, hopefully you've gotten something out of this at 9, whatever time it is in the morning. But our outlook for the games industry spending in the US this year has also swung pretty wildly. Coming into this year, we had a 4.3% growth forecast. Of course, it helped that GTA 6 was still in the year. And it sure helped that we didn't have the tariff situation and some of these other situations we're seeing right now. As of the moment, though, we're looking at about a down 4.7% outlook, really impacting all areas of spend. Mobile struggling a little bit this year. The console world, of course, has been struggling going into the launch of the Switch 2. We'll see how powerful and sustained that launch is. But generally, we have a consumer who's a little bit concerned. They're holding back a little bit, and they really need to be pushed with the concept of value for their gaming dollar. So what to watch going forward? Number one, people still love video games. I mean, we've seen it the last couple of days. We've seen it in the response to Switch 2. People are still very, very excited. Of course they are. It's a wonderful category that continues to do some amazing things, but they're looking for certain things. Number one, they're looking for value. And I know we've been doing a lot of $80 games and subscriptions and free to play and all these other things happening. No matter what, the consumer has to believe they're getting a good value for their dollar. Number two, the ease of accessibility is a huge factor. Really what I'm talking about here is the Fortnite factor. We have the $80 games, and that will work for some games and some consumers. But for younger consumers in particular, the biggest competitor at any new game is going to be Fortnite, because it's so easy to access. They can play it wherever they are, whenever they want to. So the more easily accessible games are, the better it's going to be in this particular market environment. Subscription boost may continue. We saw a subscription market boom in the pandemic window, and then it flattened, was flat for a couple of years. It had a little bit of an uptick when Call of Duty made it to Game Pass, but after that, we saw an uptick again in February and in March and in April. Now that could be content related, but it also could be consumers saying, hey, I want to have better value for my dollar. So I'm going to, lean into those categories that could deliver that. So just keep that in mind. Keep an eye on that. I'll keep talking about that in the future. And finally, one of the things that may impact it hasn't quite impacted us yet in all categories, although it has in some. Higher prices and potential supply shortages in the US could certainly exacerbate the challenges we're facing. So big, crazy market, but the key takeaways are we are seeing some shifting in dollars away from general merchandise categories to things like food. The consumer is hyper-fixated on value, and the consumer response to things like tariffs continues to be in flux.
There's the Matt there, extended bit from his talk at the Game Business Live. And he sort of tries to end on a bit of a positive note. He's talking there about how games that offer value subscription services, mobile free-to-play might be an opportunity. But I think he was stretching it to find those positives. It's interesting because I think this is particularly severe for consoles. We had Sega on the show earlier in the week who talked about the fact that it's tough out there for consoles having to raise their prices as a result of these tariffs, but also just generally that because generally having to do that. Everyone's raising the price of games in order to manage the fact that spending is falling, which in many ways exacerbates the audience problem. It's a short-term solution. Rebekah, it's a really difficult thing because he talks about value and trying to make that value case for the video games industry. But I think it's just, but it's really struggling to do that. I saw that with the Switch 2, for instance. You could buy Mario Kart and a Switch 2 in a bundle, and if you had Nintendo Switch Online and some Zelda games, you could get what might look like a good value deal, but that wasn't the message that was getting through to consumers. It was very much, this is expensive. The games are expensive. The accessories are expensive. The headlines in the mainstream media was about the price of this device. It wasn't about, how good Mario Kart was or how great Donkey Kong looks. I guess the question that I'm trying to work out, I think the whole industry working out, is how can we get that value message across to the players? Because people still buy expensive things. I went to Lincoln Park gig at the weekend. It cost me like £300.
I would never have pegged you as a Linkin Park fan. That's incredible.
Fun fact, it turns out Jeff Keighley was also at the same gig and I didn't know.
Amazing.
Well, I did eventually right now. Yes, but people going to gigs on, they're selling out faster than ever, particularly the big gigs. People are spending loads of money on merchandise and things. So people do spend money on these things if they feel like they're getting some value out of it.
It's tough, right? I think video game companies are still sort of testing the water and figuring that out. Because I think about the Switch 2 announcements and what you're describing with the headlines around price. And I remember thinking when all that was going on, they had that Nintendo Direct where they sort of showed off everything that they had. And this was before I believe it was before they had announced the price. And I remember walking away from that Direct thinking, wow, that was incredible. This is going to be phenomenal. And then after that, there was just this slow rollout of announcements about price. And Nintendo was, I think, in some ways kind of screwed over a little bit by the fact that all that tariff news was hitting at the exact same time. So people had like this constant churning worry in the back of their head of, oh no, everything else is going to get more expensive too. But they announced the price of the console, and then there was this whole confusion around how much. There was a lot of confusion online about how much Mario Kart was going to cost. Was it going to be $80? Was it going to be $70? Was it going to be different? Some people there were headlines going around saying it was going to be $90 at one point, and this is all USD. But there was confusion as to what the actual price was going to be, but it seemed higher than everyone was prepared to pay. There wasn't a lot of clarity immediately as to how much Donkey Kong Bonanza was going to be, and if all the games were going to be $80. There was all this confusion about the digital cards and game cards and all these things like that. And then we started seeing the accessory costs, and then they had to raise the accessory costs. And so it felt like just one hit after another. And in some ways, I think Nintendo lost control of the news cycle there a little bit. And that's less we priced this wrong issue and more we did not message this correctly and also got hit by this other factor that we were not expecting.
Nintendo are terrified of sharing prices. And it's driven by an EU ruling when they were accused of price fixing. Ever since then, they've been like, retailers set the price, we don't set the price. It's been their mantra. And as a result of that, They don't announce the price for their things. In this case, it caused a vacuum of people trying to work out. The $90 thing came from the fact that the physical version of Mario Kart was more expensive in the UK than the digital version. They knew what the digital version cost in the US, so the conclusion was that therefore the physical version was probably going to cost this. It wasn't the case at all in the end.
But then you might have this number offhand. I don't have it off the top of my head. Was it like 80% of people who bought a Switch bought the Mario Kart bundle?
Yeah.
And if you did that, the Mario Kart, the game was technically only $50, compared to the full price.
Yeah, it's £30 in the UK.
People felt like they were getting a good value.
Yeah. It's interesting because there was also those headlines, and to be fair, certain corners of the media very much jumped on it. Like there was that articles that I read about the Zelda Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom would cost you, Breath of the Wild I think was going to cost you $90 it on Switch 2. That's if you didn't have Breath of the Wild. That's if you bought the DLC, and that's if you didn't have Nintendo Switch Online. That it would cost you $90.
You wouldn't know anybody in the room who happened to write one of those articles, would you?
Yeah. Was that you?
I think I may have contributed to that discourse in some fashion.
Obviously, technically, that's true, but actually, for most people who would have bought Switch 2 at launch would have been Nintendo fans that already had Breath of the Wild, and probably were subscribers to Nintendo Switch Online as well. So actually, the way I looked at it as a consumer rather than as a business journalist is I bought my Switch 2 in the UK. It was £450. I got the console. I got Mario Kart World bundled with it, and both of my Zelda games that I love so much were upgraded for. Not actually free, because I had to subscribe to Nintendo Switch Online, but free at the point of the purchase, effectively. And I actually thought, well, that's not. I mean, don't be wrong; it's still a lot of money if you're worrying about food bills. Yeah. But it's like that wasn't too terrible a deal. But that alternative messaging wasn't getting out there.
Well, I think I'll say in our defense, at least, that we wrote about it because consumers were talking about it.
Yeah.
We're a consumer facing website, and so what we're doing is we're going to the community after a big news story like this and seeing, okay, well, what are people talking about? What are they interested in? And overwhelmingly, it was, wow, this is. It's always taken an aggregate. This is so expensive. And I think that's why Nintendo has been sort of on the receiving end of a lot of this criticism specifically, is because they're the ones, I mean, they took the first hit, right? Like they're the ones who released a new console in the middle of this economic environment, right as all these tariffs were happening.
Yeah.
And they're releasing a bunch of things at once. And you forget how expensive it is, like the startup cost effectively of a new console. Like I'm not buying a new Switch Pro controller every month on a regular basis. But when you first buy a new console, you're probably getting an extra controller board or two. You're probably getting a game or two. And that gets really expensive. And when everything else is just beating down on you, I don't know, people really feel it. So I'm hoping that was a really great presentation from Matt. I want to go watch the whole thing now. No one else is doing a big console launch for the immediate foreseeable future. So I'm hoping that no one, there's not quite as much fear around video game spending as it feels like there might be right now.
Yeah, and also it's worth noting Nintendo's the biggest as well.
Yeah.
So it's very much, affects a lot more people. The concern is that prices don't seem to be going down even as the generations go on.
When have they ever?
Yeah, a lot of the concerns going forward is around tariffs, with potential for more tariffs to come. I actually caught up with the ESA president and CEO Stanley Pierre-Louis just last week, and we talked about many things. It wasn't just about tariffs, but I did get a comment from him about tariffs because ultimately the ESA is on the front line of this with government to try and curb tariffs around video game hardware. This is a shorter clip, but here's Stanley talking about what they're doing around tariffs.
The most important thing for us is making sure that we are able to get games and game playing devices to the public and do it at a reasonable cost. And obviously tariffs can have a very difficult impact depending on where they land. So as an industry, what we've done is spoken to the administration to explain the value propositions that games bring. Of course, we agree with a goal of promoting and expanding American industries. And in many ways, the U.S. is a top exporter of games, if not the top exporter of games to the rest of the world. But we also have to make sure to maintain that lead. You've got to be able to develop those games. That means allowing game companies to create fantastic games with the best talent that they can here in the US, but also getting devices into the hands of consumers in an affordable way. And we've raised those concerns with the administration, and we continue to work with them on understanding why what we bring to bear is critically important. If you think about the $59 billion or so that the video game industry generated this past year, just under $5 billion of it is based on the consoles, and the overwhelming rest of it is on game content. And so in many ways, consoles are the gateway to unlocking this enormous value proposition for consumers and also for the American economy. And we've tried to make that case to establish the fact that, games are made everywhere, and you want to be able to play them on consoles that people can afford here in the US. So that's been an important conversation point for us with the administration.
Yes, the tariff situation is going to come around again imminently. And I guess all the games industry can do is just focus on the value argument. The US administration right now is unpredictable. I know there's a lot of concerns around what might happen if they perhaps spend too much extra attention on the video games industry. We'll have to hope that there's not going to be too much more impact from tariffs on the video game side of things, and that the ESA message gets through.
Yeah. He does bring up, I think, a good point as well, talking about companies needing to be able to make games in the United States. This is very anecdotal. I'm sure somebody has done some sort of data-driven study on this. But I have been hearing increasing, I mean, we always hear about, companies opening new studios or whatever. In my conversations with people in the industry, I'm hearing increasingly when people are opening new studios or new branches of whatever it is they're doing, they're not doing it in the US. And I'm hearing a lot about places that are prioritizing closing things in the United States or moving various different points of their operations overseas, just because it's so much more expensive to do things in the United States. The startup cost is more expensive. It's more expensive to move people out to where, because we're so geographically large. There's, a handful. If you want to have people in an office, there's really only a handful of cities that you probably want to do that in. And it's expensive to move people out there. Cost of living is ridiculously high. Real estate is really high. Everything is just expensive, and it's just easier to not do it here. And if we are throwing tariffs on top of that, whatever those tariffs happen to be on, is probably going to affect being able to run a business, even if it's making video games in some fashion.
The US is one of the biggest exporters of video game software in the world, and it's already under pressure because of those business costs you mentioned. And then the impact, this will impact globally, but the impact of a smaller US games industry has an impact upon their software industry in exchange for, I guess, getting hardware in your manufacturing. I guess that's the message the ESA is trying to get across. Well, I'm going to leave the conversation, the quite miserable conversation around consumers and tariffs and the state of the business at the moment. Ultimately, games are still selling very well. We've seen a lot of big sales numbers in June. We talked about that last week. There are still big video games out there. It's a lot of competition, but people are still buying games. Hobby people like video games can be good value entertainment as well. I think there is better value out there now that we're free to play.
It's simultaneously one of the most expensive hobbies to have, but also, if you're savvy, one of the cheapest hobbies you can have. There are so many games that you can pick up and play with the stuff that you have currently for free. It may not necessarily be the exact games your friends are playing or the hottest game in the moment, but there are games there for you.
Yes. And let's talk about one of the other stories of the week. This is about 11-bit Studios. They have admitted to using AI-generated text accidentally in an area of its game, The Altairs. I say accidentally. The AI text was meant to be work-in-progress material that made its way into the final product. It also used AI to handle some last-minute translations for in-game licensed movies. It stirred quite the reaction online, and people are very much on the lookout for anything that might appear to be AI at the moment, which I guess might be a good thing.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
I was very interested in the reaction to this. Personally, I'm probably about as anti-generative AI as they come. But I was surprised by the reaction to this, because their explanation of this was that there was one section of text that they had used. They were using generative AI as a placeholder during development, and they had just happened to miss going back through and removing this and putting in actual real text later on. And that was that explanation. And then the translation thing, they said there was some very, very last minute stuff that they needed translated very quickly. And they did it through generative AI, and they were planning on hiring somebody. That one, I understand why people are quite up in arms about that. The bit about the placeholder thing, though, I'm surprised that people are angry about that. And because the argument, though, is that why are you it had to be put through a prompter to try to get something that looked very similar to an actual asset, when in reality, people use all sorts of things for placeholders in game development. Yeah. You could just put, we're in journalism, we use TK. Like there are so many other avenues. I guess I didn't expect the general community at large to sort of share my eyebrow raise at that.
I used to work in games testing, and one of the bugs and particularly I work for a localization company. And so one of the bugs that was a very popular bug, to the point it was in the top-down menu, you didn't have to type it in, it was one you could select, was placeholder text, which meant that you've not put the text in here. You've put in you put in the Ipsum Mori, whatever, text in, or you've put in just X's or whatever, or you put in a load of symbols.
This is placeholder text.
Yeah, this is placeholder text.
Big capital letters.
Often that's done because they plan to put it in later, or they've got a deadline to hit and they've gone, well, I just need to put some text in so I can get this over to testers, or get this over to whatever they need to get it over to.
Right.
I get it. And I used to work in magazines, and it was quite common that, I can't come up with a headline right now. I need to get it over to the designer to get it designed. So, and you would do that. And there's a story, there's a James Batchelor story, Rebekah, you might like this. Many, many years ago, James wrote a headline in a box out called it was a box out in a magazine around the marketing for a video game. And instead of James putting in X's or whatever it is to make it obvious that this was placeholder text, he put the words in marketing bollocks. That's what he put in. Because he knew it's the marketing bollocks. He was being flippant. Yeah. But because he put in actual text and we were very rushed on deadline, I didn't see it. He forgot he put it in. And it was thankfully the designer caught it. But there's been cases where the designer hasn't caught it.
This is such a believable story. Oh my gosh.
And if you put in placeholder text that is actual text, there is a chance you will miss it because the testers won't know that it's not supposed to be, that it's not supposed to be like that necessarily, right? Depending on who you're talking to. So that's what I mean. Like if you're going to put placeholder images or placeholder text into things, make it an obviously placeholder text and placeholder image, like because you're more likely to spot it, your testers are more likely to catch it, and also it's a bit embarrassing when consumers go like that, but you're not going to get a backlash in the sense of it's just a bit humiliating. Either patching
really critically, if you're doing something like that, if you're putting in placeholder, the idea is you don't have time to write anything for real, and so you're just sort of slapping something in and sending it off so you can get back to it later. The reason why people found out this was generative AI is because the text starts with, I don't have it in front of me, but it's something like, okay, here's a version of what you just asked for that has this, this, and this. So it was somebody putting prompts into a prompter and then revising them and like actually spending time on it. Probably, I mean, certainly not as much time as it would have taken to actually write something organic, but spending time on it, which is not the point of placeholder text. And that I guess I was again, you know where my sentiments lie on this, but like I was somewhat pleasantly surprised that people were like really picking up on this and digging into it, because I don't know, maybe I'm turning cynical or something, but I just sort of, I don't know, I'm sort of afraid that generative AI is going to consume us all, and there
is. I get accused. I got accused of tweets that I wrote as being generative AI. Sometimes it does go the other way when everyone's looking for anything that could be generative. There's a big story at the moment around a band that's been accused of being an AI band because none of the members exist apparently, and now they've set up a Twitter account to argue they're not AI, that they're real.
Oh my gosh!
And it's like,
I think. I don't want to type to look it up because I don't want you to listen to my mechanical keyboard on a podcast. But there was I can't remember where it was, but there was a really good article like a week or two ago that was interviewing developers who had been accused of using generative AI in their games who didn't. Because everybody thinks that they're very savvy at catching this down, especially with images. People think that they're very savvy at catching generative AI because there's a certain like sort of shiny quality that generative AI tends to spit out a lot. And so if you have this very specific art style in your game, people might think it's generative AI, even if it's not. Palworld got accused of this, and Palworld maintains to this day and has shown like multiple like sort of in progress, like here is how we made this step by step. It's not generative AI. And I think people mostly backed off those accusations, but it can be really damaging.
Yeah, but individually, there's an artist I saw on Twitter, or it might have been Blue Sky, where one of the social media platforms, where probably was Blue Sky, where somebody had called out an artist for AI imagery and actually was like trying to work out how they could sue them and everything, and because the hands that they'd drawn looked a bit off, and it was like a 7-line tweet, and there was a lot of people getting angry and saying, you've been hurt, you've been harmed. And then the artist had to reply and actually show the actual video of making the art to prove that made the art. Are we at that stage now? We have to film ourselves to prove that we wrote it. But I guess that's the downside of this scrutiny from consumers that are looking for this stuff. And
I think it's because we can't, we clearly can't, because there's disclaimers on Steam, but 11-bit didn't use those, and so we can't trust, right? Like there's no trust that people aren't just going to use generative AI and then lie to us about it. That article, by the way, is in The Guardian, and it's by Nicole Carpenter. I wanted to attribute that.
Yes. Yeah. And you're right. It's about trust. But then also studios need to trust their own teams, and they've got to catch it them as well, right? It's individual behaviors that can lead to this situation. But it's an ongoing conversation. Finally, our last section, as I said, there is another big news story that you will have all heard of by now that I didn't know the full details of in recording this podcast. So that's why our last segment isn't about that. It's what do the numbers mean, as we used to call it on the GI Microcast. This week, we're diving into the new PlayStation release, Death Stranding 2. Now, Hideo Kojima said he changed things in Death Stranding 2 to ensure it was less mainstream. And the initial results that I reported on suggested that it worked. Well done. It's not mainstream. In terms of physical sales across Europe, Death Stranding 2 sold about 2/3 less at launch than Death Stranding 1. Now, Death Stranding 1 was a pre-pandemic release. So this is a far more physical-friendly time. Death Stranding 2 also had an early access promotion on digital, so you could get the game a couple of days early. So as a result, we would have got a lot more sales of digital. Because of this, I didn't want to talk about it in a way. It's like, I don't want to sit there and say the game did well, did badly without digital data. So I asked Ampere. Now, Ampere tracks player numbers and that kind of stuff. Early player numbers only tell, it's very early days for that game, really. But I wanted Ampere Ampere might give me a little bit of an indicator. And their estimate is that the game has sold 1.4 million units in June. It's an estimate, stress that. It's not actual data from GSD or Circana or anyone like that. But I think that's all right. Right? But there are other analysts that I've spoken to since receiving that data who don't. It's a very niche game, Death Stranding. Yeah. The first one was polarizing. So even though the game did like 5 million units, I think, in 2 years, I don't think all those 5 million people liked it.
It was weird, right? Like people didn't know what to make of it. And also, I think the first Death Stranding had been promoted, like you said, it had been promoted much more heavily. It was like Kojima's debut game after escaping Konami, effectively. And people wanted to see what the deal is, what it's all about. And yeah, I think you're right. I think not everybody enjoyed it. And if Death Stranding 2 had just been it was Death Stranding 1, and we saw the exact same advertisements in a vacuum, not knowing what Death Stranding was, I think maybe it would have captured roughly as much interest, just because it's weird and stand out. But I think knowing what Death Stranding is, you kind of already know where you sit on it. Yeah. And
this one's reviewed a lot better. I think it's a little more palatable to people. And I think that means it has a good shot of reaching audiences. This is a different games market now where, the game does come out, it doesn't do great. But I don't think in today's market, we saw Concord did like 25,000 units. That's the bottom. Right. We celebrated Dune Awakening last week doing 1 million units, and this has done more than. So it's a PlayStation 5 only game. It'll come out on the sort of world tour they're going on at the moment, still going on. It was in London this week. So I don't think that's a terrible figure if it's right. I think it's okay. It's obviously not Ghost of Yotai, God of War, and Spider-Man level PlayStation performance, but I don't think anyone was expecting it. I actually saw quite a lot of Death Stranding 2 ads. I think it was because of that quite striking imagery of Norman Reedus and the baby. I think it's quite a striking advert. But it is obviously, he's our David Lynch, I guess, Kojima, right?
As I suppose he is, yeah.
David Lynch wasn't very successful either, but he was very well, but he was in terms of, acclaim and fan base.
Well, I do wonder, you say that nobody's expecting it to do wild numbers. I don't know.
Well, I wasn't expecting it to do wild numbers.
No, but you point to several releases over the last couple of years that have done pretty well, but did not meet expectations in big scare quotes as to whoever was expecting their numbers. And that's the thing, right? I feel like there's certain companies and certain folks that sort of control whether studios get to make more games or not that have very, very high expectations for things. And Kojima being the David Lynch or whoever of video games, no one's going to shut him and his studio down at this stage in his career. So I'm not really worried that we're never going to get another game like that. But I do wonder, like, what do those numbers mean for like Sony and PlayStation, and what do they think when they look at it?
That's a good question, right? Because it's possible that 1.4 million, however many millions it does in the end, doesn't actually make back the investment that PlayStation's put in the studio, possibly, right? But platform holders have a different metric on these things. You for the same reason why Nintendo invested in Bayonetta, right? People who love Kojima, and there are massive, Metal Gear, there are dedicated, devoted fans. They will buy a platform to play a Kojima game, right? So they've got Death Stranding. You've got Death Stranding 1 and 2 exclusive on your console. You are going to get those fans on your console, and they're going to play your console, and they might subscribe to your subscription service, or they might buy a different game, and they might, it brings them into an ecosystem. So the actual value of a game like Death Stranding, which is a very, it has a very high spending audience potentially, is higher than the just pure numbers of how many games it sold. It's the same with games like Bayonetta. Bayonetta didn't make sense commercially to Sega, but it did to Nintendo. It's because Bayonetta fans bought Nintendo platforms and then maybe bought Zelda 2 and Nintendo Switch Online, and so there is a different equation being played there, that when they make a game like that. But so that's why you get platform holders. Why I'm slightly concerned about Xbox's future direction. Why Xbox currently make a load of games like Clockwork Revolution and Hellblade even, and South of Midnight, which
look
again,
what happened to Hi-Fi Rush.
And Hi-Fi Rush is a great example, actually, because it's a game that actually that should be bringing, that will bring in a potentially neat. It maybe didn't do well enough for. Well, I don't know what the metrics were. I think that was a shame. I think that game should have continued. I think that needed a second game. But investing in those smaller IPs, and I use the word smaller IPs in the sense that compared to Call of Duty and Minecraft, then everything's smaller. But investing in those sort of AA smaller brands on a platform holders will do that. But a publisher doesn't necessarily, because they need to see bigger returns and margins. They've also got 30% store fees to pay for and all that kind of thing. So so it's I'm not concerned about Kojima either.
No.
Because he's always going to have a pull with a large. I think if you've got 1 million people who will come out to buy your game in a week, then you're probably fine.
Well, you would think my argument is not that Kojima is ever going to be in any trouble again regarding being able to make more games. It's more that he takes up a certain position in the industry where he does have that luxury to just sort of do kind of whatever he wants and get that support. But there are plenty of other games that would pull similar numbers and not see a next game just because of whatever factor, whatever expectations someone had for them not being met. It's a weird space right now.
Yeah, it certainly is. And but it may still do better yet. It has reviewed very well.
It will.
And obviously it'll come out on PC.
Yes.
But that's sort of, we're out of time, Rebekah. That's it for today's episode of the Game Business Show. Rebekah, thank you for joining us. I'd love to have you on. I'd love to have you back if you can, if you're allowed to return to talk.
Not a problem. Love to do it.
Next week on the show, we speak to Frank Gabo of Zynga as part of our feature show. That's the one that comes out on Tuesday. And we'll be recording our news analysis show at Develop Brighton next week, featuring a chap called James Batchelor. You may have heard of him. So please join us back for that. Until then, thank you for tuning in.